Okay, I'm happy to introduce today the last session of this year's book series, Conversations in the Open, or as we say in Spanish, Conversación a la intemperie, that we have been coordinating at least since the beginning of the pandemic between Lehigh University and 17 Instituto of Mexico. And it's a great pleasure today to have with us the sociologist Michalis Lianos, who is a professor at University of Rowan, and he's the author of multiple books. I'm not gonna name all of them, but I'm tempted to say that his academic research has been focusing on the transformation and the institutional web of contemporary societies and how it has transformed social power. I would just note two recent titles: the new social contract the new social control, conflict and the social bond, from the first one from 2012, the second one from 2019. And most recently, and this is going to be the book, the object of the discussion for today's session, is Direct Democracy, The Change Toward Holistic Politics, which is a short book. I'm not sure. I guess Michalis will tell if it's okay or proper to call this short book a manifesto of some sort. It's a manifesto that I think that should be or could be read also in light of Professor Lianos' important contributions that some of us read with great interest back during the Yellow Vest cycle, where he posed and I think deployed the important notion of experiential politics. In a way, this is also a continuation, right? And an institutional proposal and imagination regarding what to do in the wake of the crisis of epochal politics. Also with us, as we always tend to have one or two participants for each session, we have two good friends of the series, Professor John Beasley-Murray, who is a professor at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He is the author of, as we know, of Post-Hegemony, Political Theory, and Latin America. And Professor Idris Robinson, who teaches at Texas State University. And he's a regular contributor also of Lundi Matan, Ill Will, Endnotes, and has recently co-edited the special issue of the South Atlantic Quarterly on the Stygian Power. I think this will be a very interesting conversation with participants that, from different perspectives, right, or lines of critical thought, I think have been touching or trying to think through the problem of leaving behind the hegemony of politics or hegemonic politics as such, right? And trying to think a pragmatic configuration of how to reinvent democratic politics or something in the wake of what we have seen in the recent, especially the most recent cycle of revolts, that is tied to experience, to a confrontation of that is spatial in nature or around the metropolis or against the coagulation of the metropolis, right? I won't say much. I would only cite a short definition from Michalis' book, Direct Democracy, where he writes around the middle of the opuscle that, I quote, "Holistic politics maintains that the state, at least in present-day configuration, is an outdated form of political organization which will disappear like other previous forms. Every political proposal from now on must be addressed to the individual as a person, in other words, as a member of humankind, and not as a subject of this or that authority. That does not at all rule out that individual feeling that he or she is a member of a particular community or society with a specific identity. On the contrary, we must encourage and support its diversity." It seems to me that this is a strong statement and part of the vortex, not the only one, that his interesting manifesto puts out for this particular discussion, which I hope it could proliferate even more as time goes by. So I thank Idris, John, and Michalis, and I believe that Idris will go first, and John, and we'll continue from there as we usually do. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Gerardo. Yeah, thank you very much. So what I really liked about the text about direct democracy was how it seemed to be so informed by your work around the Yellow Vest movement. So I went back and I looked at those articles again, right? And I tried to read it back and forth with, as a way of kind of consolidating what you learned from the Yellow Vest into something a little more general. But one of the things that I noticed too, is that in one of the articles, probably the experiential politics article, you talk about how you saw the primary social actor within the movement as the included. So I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more about that. And in my work, especially in the stuff I've written about destituent power, I've talked a lot about how I see the included as the principal actor in a lot of these movements as well, whether it be from Tiananmen to the color revolutions in the Eastern Bloc, up until the movement of the squares and Occupy. And I would say that it's right to call this particular included subject as the main actor in the Yellow Vest as well. So I wanted you to just elaborate more about how you see that figure, how you might define it. How does it link up with other categories? How does it link up with the excluded? And that's one of the major problems that I've been trying to work through is, is there any back and forth? What is it? What are the intersections in time and space between the included and excluded? Finally, also, it seems that in the quote that Gerardo wrote, that there is a kind of dissolution of sort of groupings, certain social groupings, but there's also minimal form of grouping of identity left behind to allow for difference. So I wanted you to talk about that with regards to the included as well. So that's a lot of questions, but I think it speaks to the richness of the work.
Shall I just reply now, or are there more questions to come? So we can, yeah.
Yeah, I think we can, if it's okay, we can first go with all the interventions, and then you can pick up on anything you might find of interest, and then we can just open up the discussion more generally.
Okay, so I'll wait for the time.
Okay, I'll jump in. Like Idris, I have a bunch of questions. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you, Gerardo, for inviting me, and it's great to be here with Idris and, of course, with Michalis. I thought this was a very interesting book. It's a little bit unusual in many ways. And when Gerardo was giving us the brief introduction, he hesitated as to what genre to assign it to, deciding in the end manifesto, but there was a certain hesitation there. And I was also interested by that question of genre, but what kind of book it is. Again, Gerardo mentioned that people listening to this may not have read the book, so it's not a typical academic book for sure. It doesn't, well, it has some footnotes, but it doesn't have the kind of bibliographic apparatus that one would expect, perhaps, of an academic book. In fact, I think there's only one author cited, and in the most fleeting way possible, not even cited, mentioned. The name of Marx appears and then disappears, and no other such names appear at any point, which is, this is not a criticism, it's just an observation, again, to explain a little bit about the book. And I guess if I'm taking on that duty, I'll say that this is a book that is about, well, it's about direct democracy, as the title suggests, but it proposes what it calls holistic politics. So a new form of politics. And I guess one thing that would be helpful is just for you to expand a little bit, I think, about what you mean by holistic politics. In other words, it doesn't, just as it doesn't cite authors, it doesn't really draw on. I mean, it mentions liberal democracy, it mentions capitalism, at some length. It doesn't mention, I don't know, it doesn't I don't think the words like feminism, for instance, appear at any point, although there is a thought about minorities and minority opinions and so on and so forth. Socialism is mentioned, but as in the socialist experiments of the Eastern Bloc and so on, rather than socialism as a theory, as a analytic approach. Communism likewise, or anarchism, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a dearth of names, and there's a dearth of references to isms, let's say, you know, to theoretical approaches or political approaches that one might have been used to. And I suppose I guess my first question would be for you to talk a little bit more about why you chose to write this book in this particular way, and what audience you expect. I think that's also interesting. I mean, it's an accessible text. It's fairly short, but it's not brief either. I mean, it is 100 or so pages. So, I mean, it's a book, right, rather than a pamphlet. I mean, it's much longer than, say, I don't know, the Communist Manifesto or other manifestos that one might have read. And in that way, it doesn't quite fit the genre. Also, and again, this is perhaps just adding information for those who may not know. After, I mean, there's a whole series of principles that set out, but they're also quite detailed proposals, and about the functioning or the possible functioning of society run along the lines of holistic politics. For instance, there is basically bicameral. There's a parity assembly. There's a social assembly, but there are also a whole series of administrators and secretariats. And it becomes really quite detailed about percentages, about particular term limits, and so on and so forth. So I was interested by that, in that on the one hand, it starts with a level of abstraction, shall we say. The holistic politics means the opportunity to continually reinvent politics, and yet, perhaps inevitably, I don't know, it also becomes quite detailed in its prescriptions of what should or should not be the safeguards for such holistic philosophy. And I'm interested in that negotiation, right, in that tension between the general principles and some really quite, I don't know, strict, I would say, admonitions. Another one, for instance, is about secrecy. In fact, there's a short chapter on secrecy near the end, which says that everything should be utterly transparent. On the other hand, members of the social assembly, for instance, and the parity assembly, are not to reveal to anybody that they are members of the social assembly or the parity assembly. That seemed to be a tension too. So I'm interested in that. So I guess the first question is about genre and why you chose to write it this way, and audience. The second is a question about the tension between broad principles and then really getting into the nitty gritty, right, of form, if not substance, right? The notion is that in this holistic society, people should be able to determine priorities, above all priorities, for political action. And then I guess the third question, well, I guess this returns back to the question of genre, because if I were called to pick a genre, I'm not sure if manifesto is the genre I choose. It's almost a little bit more like speculative fiction in some ways. And at times, it's a speculative utopian fiction, but at times it feels a little dystopian. It reminded me of the Borges short story at times, The Lottery in Babylon, in which what seems like what begins as a more or less standard lottery becomes a society which is either ruled by chance utterly, or by a secretive company that may or may not exist. And it's about that, the short distance that there is, or the blurred line between utopianism and dystopianism. And it seems to me that this book also straddles and is interested in that blurred line too. That what can be utopian proposals, and this is of course the story of actually existing socialism. This is the story in a sense of the Eastern Bloc and so on and so forth. What can begin as a set of utopian proposals carries within it the germ of dystopianism too, and I'm interested in that. So I guess those are just some of my beginning questions to respond to what, as Idris says, is a very interesting and stimulating text.
Thank you. Those are excellent. And just to follow more or less what has been said, and if I can add just 2 points that that are derived from both the book and what John and Idris have said, which is that, of course, I think that an interesting distinction would be, I don't know, perhaps Michalis would tell us a little bit more about it, which is I think it might be useful to distinguish between the manifesto as a genre precisely of 20th century avant-garde politics, the party, even if it is in its aesthetic dimension, as in the famous artistic avant-gardes. And Michele, at the same time that there is a proposal, there is Lianos emphasizes the fact that there are not specific details to be resolved. So I think it has, or it's fair to say that it has an anti-programmatic dimension, meaning it doesn't really want to be a program, right? It wants to be a certain generic infrastructure, right? And in that sense, it's a sort of call, or it's a pamphlet, pamphlet in the old sense, that the great American historian Bailey talks about the pamphlet of the American revolutionaries, that is different from the constitutional order, the claims about the different ideas and institutional designs. I think that there is a certain call here for, and this will be a point that I would like to discuss, my second point, which is institutionalization. Of course, Lianos' work before writing this book has focused on the question of institutions, which is an important element today, I think, in political thought, or in the crisis of modern politics as such, and so I wanted to see if you could say a little bit more about how the question of institution or institutionalization fits in this model. And it fits avoiding, I think, two false exits, I think, and I have on the back of my head also a recent piece that Lianos wrote at Lundi Matan back in perhaps September or July of last year. The revolutionary, I think it was entitled "The Revolutionary Dilemma and the Authoritarian Trap," where it was a critique of the communitarian option, right? The idea of community as exhausting the political option for transformation, right? And one could also say, I think, that the community option is also the community of of the modern vanguard party, right? Where the not being dissenting or not being included leads to a radical exclusion of, let's say, absolute enmity, okay? And so the book, the Direct Democracy is responding, I think, to this impasse, right? Not only because historically revolution has come to an end, but also because, let's say, the structure of how to think about it has also collapsed, right? There is that on the one hand, and then there is the other problem, which is that every time, and it's also linked to this issue, which is every time that there has been a revolutionary moment or a change, a dramatic social change, it seems unavoidable that the question of authority and who has the power returns, right? I mean, this was even the problem even for the French revolutionaries, where Even Saint Just at some point referred to himself and to the Jacobins as well, as founding fathers of the new period that had to be obeyed in the future by the next generations. And so the book, I think, has very interesting suggestions about the problem of authority, which is central to legality and the conception of positive norms and law, which is I think, one of the big problems today, meaning that the collapse of politics is also the collapse of the authority of the legal framework, right, or modern law. Finally, I think, and I don't want to push too much this point or overread it, but at the same time, there's never too much overreading. I think on page 46 or so, you make the claim that holistic politics is never a local politics, so it's not a communitarian politics. But you go to say that it has a new geopolitical scale, right, or it's planetary. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the specificities of that. Is it possible to think of holistic politics as geopolitical in nature? What would that be? For me, that resonates like large space sort of projects, something that Carl Schmitt was interested in, but I don't know if that's more or less what you're thinking. At the same time, there is also a risk, it seems to me, that a planetary or a global conception of government, but there might be a trade-off there where domination might increase, right? Even if it's open to deliberation, a more transparent governance, etc. Right? But I wanted to ask you about this geopolitical dimension. But I'll leave it here for the moment.
Leslie, shall I say that I'm very honored to have this discussion with you, and the fact that you've read the book and took the time to look at the various arguments and the content from several points of view. And of course, thank you very much for your initial questions, which certainly helped me explain in some ways how the book works. Firstly, there is certainly to start perhaps with John's observation. There is certainly an issue regarding the identity, so to speak, of books in general for me. As you know, I'm an academic, and I have written academic books like everyone else. Now, this is entirely different for a series of reasons. The first reason is that I think that the expression of thought, and particularly political thought, in the form of a book, and particularly an academic book, and particularly an academic book in the social sciences and humanities, is desperately obsolete. And I don't know, why we do that, apart from the fact that we're probably within a hegemonic dynamics that we are part of, and of course we are all aware, I think, what is the specific remit, function, and probably attractiveness of these books. The second part of it is that I don't think that, politically speaking, political theory as we know it can bring anything. And I know this is a very severe judgment that I'm passing now, but I don't think that it can contribute anything significant in its traditional when I say traditional form, I mean the form that we all recognize as a form of expression of political critique. That is, that we have some ideas. These ideas are extremely complex. They become more complex when we develop a critique of them, and then even more complex when they're being discussed by others, and so on and so forth. And of course, this at some point becomes a strictly intellectual discussion, which is a political problem as such, I think. Thirdly, the change that we live through now imposes on us, I think, another genre, so to speak, of political thinking, particularly because the attention that needs to turn towards individuals, the individual as such, is so important. And the fact that the social and political collectivities have changed enormously, which is something that I also work on, through the notion of experiential politics and so on, obliges us to deliver some type of discourse that can tell people what is the problem, to what extent the problem is possible to solve theoretically, and what are the plausible examples of solving it. So it must be at the same time a political manifesto, a political theory, and a manual. So indeed, I took the risk to write something like that, which otherwise, from a point of view of our standard categories, makes no sense. But I think makes sense. I'm not saying that this will become a very popular book. As you know, it is conditions that decide on whether any kind of idea will take any credit. But the thing is that it is thought of also as a complete manual. So if we look at it from that point of view, then the reference to existing political approaches is redundant in the sense that people as such know when they're involved in political thinking. And what I mean by political thinking, I mean when they're wondering in which direction politics should go, they have already integrated that political thinking, theoretical political thinking, in the way that they can understand it. That is, if we are I suppose we all have experience of social movements and so on. So there's no reason to think that you need to master all the intricacies of the capital in order to understand what communism is for someone who is part of a social movement, right? And of course, that social movement would not exist as a communist social movement if that were a precondition, right? So in that sense, the ideas express themselves at this point historically. So what I try to do is to engage at this historical level, which does not need references, but taps into experiences. So people understand what it means, for example, to be, let's say, competing with each other. What it means to be able to resolve some kind of conflict. What it means to be able to make decisions together. What it means to use or not use the market, and to what extent. That is enough for me. And I think that is very important, at least for me, it was very important, politically speaking, in terms of political theory, to keep it there. Because in my view, talking to people who are in these concrete conditions is the real political act. It's not an intellectual act, but it's a political act in that sense. So this much about the genre of the book. Now, in terms of the audience, actually, I have no answer to it. I have no answer to it for a very simple reason that I already alluded to, which is that it's conditions that decide. Will it be useful to someone? Will someone discover it in some specific conditions? I don't know. To me, what was important is to, so to speak, to fulfill my duty in order to produce that kind of what I think to be an innovation in political thought. The rest is out there, and of course I will do my bit, if possible, for it to fare well. But you know, that's all there is to it. As we know, in many ways, manifestos in general fail until some people who are in the right conditions work with them. So it's not brilliance that does the job, it's history. Now, regarding the issue of the included and the excluded subject that Idris brought up, I think that there are things that are were unique, so to speak, regarding movements of petite bourgeoisie, like, for example, the Gilets jaunes. And that's why I was so interested in that movement. Because it was a movement that did not immediately move towards what people call populism. And one can have a long discussion about what this means, to what extent it exists, and so on and so forth. But it was not that. It was not that. It was another thing that had to do with the understanding and the conditions of democracy. And this ties with what Gerardo said regarding the tetralema, as I call it, of revolution. That is, 4 possible ways in which a revolutionary movement can go. Because then what you can see, if you are part of this, you know, over time, is how frustration, so to speak, via power, political power, transforms political actors, in this case, the yellow vests, into actors that simply seek conflict and therefore overcoming the force that oppresses them, which is devastating, in my view, politically, because there is no better way to limit the possibilities of a political vision than to create a tit-for-tat antagonistic relation, which is, you know, there are 2 possible outcomes, so to speak. One outcome is that your adversary, who is already in place, will win, right? And then we'll see what happens to you. And my tetralema talks about that. Or you will win, but in order to win, you will have transformed yourself more or less according to the conditions and the priorities of your adversary. This is what I call converting to the position of the enemy, which is what conflicts do. So essentially, for us, we're trying to find a solution that is a third solution to that game. It is a solution of liberation, a solution that goes away from oppressive power, and so on and so forth. There is no possibility to win. This is the undercurrent, therefore, for what I call holistic politics. That is, instead of focusing as we focused over the ages, and this has to do, in my view, with our primate nature, it's not a coincidence. As we have focused over the ages on conflict, is there a way of focusing on a political process that is at the same time revolutionary and continuous? That's the important thing. Not in the sense of, the kind of advertising slogan, continuous revolution. This is obviously not what I mean. What I mean is some continuous transformative process that keeps people on their toes in terms of changing themselves and others in order to live according to specific principles. So if you think from that point of view, then what you have to do is to show which are the principles, that is how to set that type of principle, and then to give an example of how some institutional design can apply it without putting an end to it. And that is very difficult, I must say. I have never written anything that is so difficult. For example, this, I have done a lot of reading in many areas in order to write this. There are no references, of course. I would say it took me about 10 years to write this, right? Why? Because let's say the principle, one of the questions has to do with the issue of difference. For example, John said, why there is no reference to what we all know as an important component of contentious politics. For example, feminism, for example, class, for example, and so on and so forth. Well, because these components, conceptually speaking, in my view, am I too long? Am I too long? Shall I stop and
No. This is great. Continue, please.
Okay.
We have time.
So, if you look, at it from this point of view, what would happen is that these categories are. John says, raising more questions. This is becoming interesting. I'm thankful for that. So these categories, to me, are from the point of view that are raised, outcomes of conflict. That is, once you're in a position that is subordinate, let's say, in terms of power, you will have to conceive of it in order to fight in some way. And that way will generate a community. And that community will be based on sexual preference, will be based on race, will be based on religion, will be based on, gender or whatever have you. At any rate, once other people manage to determine you in some way, then you will have to invent a political category to fight. Now, because we're primates and this happens to us, and we cannot go over it, one way of doing it is by sortition and secrecy, that is discretion in that sense. That's why, I put that discretion into it, because discretion diminishes essentially conflictual relations. You manage to put that as a foundation, politically speaking, that can be acceptable by all at a level of reflexivity that is otherwise impossible. The second issue is the fundamental political question that we all know about, violence. What do you do with people, with parties, with collectivities that do not agree with you? With collectivities, they want to make you do things or expect things from you, and so on and so forth. It is for me, it is very important. I'm completely a non-violent, so to speak, political theorist in that sense. It is very important to have an intelligent design that diffuses violence. And I said, not only because of its terrible consequences, but because it does not give good outcomes in terms of power. You know, you get new bosses essentially. Sometimes they're better, yeah. You know, you may replace the aristocracy with the bourgeois, but still today, you know, two centuries after the French Revolution, France remains a bourgeois paradise. So it tells you, you know, how things work. So in order to diffuse that, you need to have an institutional design that generates and keeps diversity in place. That's why I'm talking about socio-diversity. Now, if you join these two things, then the individual becomes a setting of political existence and understanding that is not universal, but is universally participative. What I mean by that? This pertains to the question of Gerardo, which is geopolitics, right? How can you these days pretend that something can be universal, right? Now, it is not my claim that, you know, this is humanly universal in the sense that is so criticized today. What I'm trying to say is that once you are in an institutional design that gives you the possibility to participate in a correct way, and at the same time drives you towards the understanding of what other people want, people that may disagree with you, then you are in a position that is the same for any human anywhere. So the unity of the political standing of an individual can be served by that type of politics that I call holistic politics. That is, you can be in a very traditional community somewhere that has another set of principles, and you can be, you know, in a very avant-garde collectivity. The same principles can work in the same way, provided that there is certition, so that power is not attributed symbolically, is not inalienable. That's very important. You know, nobody holds it as such symbolically. And at the same time, everybody is aware that diversity is there to be continuously. One of the interesting points is the branching out point, so to speak. I don't know if you, there are many details, as John said. The branching out point is something that tells that, you know, some people can have a social experiment and then, of course, get back and report on it or develop another way of life in parallel to the main collectivity or society or whatever. So experimenting under different principles that are compatible with the general social life is also a lesson on what works politically. Why? Because that puts a lot of oil in the cogs of an existing society. I'm coming back to the question of Idris regarding that point, social diversity, and the undercurrent, of course, of destituent power, which I think is very important here. As we all know, radical political theory these days, apart from the militant part, which is increasing, right? What, its adversaries call wokeism. But let's say the radical political theory today has to do with a reduction of power, right? To the point where the question has been raised for about 30 years now or more, how to become ungovernable and remain so, right? To me, as a sociologist, as a political sociologist, this is, you will allow me to say, gibberish. There is no way for a socialized human being to become ungovernable. Because a human being cannot be alone and cannot be self-generated. So, socialization as such is governance, period. And socialization, in that sense, is also hegemony by itself. I'm not saying that one content is the same as another or as desirable as another, right? I'm just saying that there is no way out of this box. So the important thing is to live, politically speaking, intelligently with these resources, rather than in the illusion that we can do something against them. It is impossible to become asocial. People, for example, who are militant today and think that they are changing fundamentally, not the expression of power, but power itself, do not understand how deep they are into the feeling and the need of recognition. If you see, for example, that the details of claims around sexual identity, you understand to what degree the depth of that need for recognition goes. So, politically speaking, this is not only inevitable, is beyond inevitable, so to speak, it's natural. So, we better exploit it rather than fight against it. And now, of course, you have a separate issue which kind of latches onto it, which is the issue of consent. That is, if this is so intelligent and smart and, and can lead us to some interesting political outcome without blood and tears, why hasn't it already been done? The issue is, to what extent it is possible to represent society, I think, in a way where you perceive yourself as an equal political actor. If you look at human history, so to speak, right, we all know there is a jump, or at least that's what we're being taught still. There is a jump in Athens, ancient Athens, and that's it. And then there is modernity. So, more or less 200 years. It's not much. Now we're coming out of it. And I think it is very important to propose something with this new form, so to speak, of institutional design, where we acknowledge that doing things continuously can be preferable in terms of radical politics, as I underline this, in terms of radical politics, than by trying to advance by conflict, which keeps us in the same position where power is reified, because obviously we all know what this is about, seize power, right? So holistic politics is a way of saying in many instances, it's a way of saying that power is not a thing, power is not a tool. Power is, you know, it's a little Foucauldian in that sense. It is what makes people do things. And because it is inevitable that we make each other do things, perhaps we can choose the things that we can make each other do. That's why the detail in the institutional design for me is very important. For example, I do understand that to a certain extent, secrecy will be necessary. Another issue is that, of course, you have to speak to conservative people about all this and reassure them in order for them to participate, because we have such contempt ourselves for conservative people that we cannot engage with them in some way that allows us to put a decent proposal, decent political proposal to them. It is always an issue of fight. Let's say, you know, an objection of some conservative person would be, well, what do you do with the army? You just disarm yourself and hope that other people will be good to you? And that's it. That's where it ends when you discuss, politically speaking, with someone who is conservative. That is, the essential issue is self-defense. The essential issue is my social position, and so on and so forth. You have to have answers for these things that trigger blocking reactions. So what I tried to do with this is a kind of political theory with institutional design, with some kind of prediction and response to obvious objections. So I'll stop here. I've talked too much. I'm sorry about that. And you know, let you you know, give me your observations.
No, this is great. Thank you. Thank you, Michalis. There's a lot of material and ideas to discuss, and so just feel free to jump in and respond to what Michalis has said. I have a few things to respond to as well, but I think John wanted to intervene.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks again, Michalis. But I did want to jump in, as I said, you're raising still more questions for me, and it's all the more intriguing. So one of the things you just said is the notion that socialization is hegemony. Obviously, there's a big red flag for me for various reasons. You don't need to be too bothered about that. But I'm interested. You know, it's one of the points at which, you know, it catches my interest, because you also said earlier on in your answers just now, you said something, and I didn't get the exact phrase, but that there should be no antagonism. And it made me think, I mean, this is so very different from, for instance, just to take one, to invoke one name, you know, Leclerc, right? This is a vision in which there's neither antagonism nor equivalence, I think, right? And so in that sense, it is a vision of a kind of absolute politics that becomes the exhaustion of politics too. I mean, this is a post-political society, the one that you're that you're outlining here. Again, without antagonism or equivalence, I suggest there's no politics, which is I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but I do think I do have a problem with other aspects of what you're outlining. And let me put it this way. So there's no antagonism, but there's continual competition. Now you present that as a form of realism. You present that as a kind of historical realism and, I don't know, an anthropological realism. The notion that we are competitive animals, the anthropological, and the historical realism is you can't just start anew. This is not really a revolutionary proposal. You need to build on where we are at the moment, and capitalism is essentially a competitive enterprise. So it's perpetual competition, but without antagonism. And you envision this in terms of a game, which also caught my eye. And again, if I will sort of introduce what could be, I don't know, what are possible interlocutors or missing names, it made me think a lot of Bourdieu, who perhaps has gone more fully than, I don't know, most sociologists or social theorists to think about the social order in terms of game playing. And in fact, back to the genre, as I said, it didn't really feel like a manifesto to me. I suggested it might be speculative fiction, whether utopian or dystopian. I wasn't entirely sure. But I also thought it might make an interesting game, maybe a board game or a computer game or something, a game that the family could play, and you'd be, by chance, you'd be assigned membership on the social assembly, but you couldn't tell anyone. But maybe you'd assign a member, you pick up a card and you're assigned to the parity assembly, but you couldn't tell anyone, and you wouldn't know why you were chosen either. That's back to the Borges. You're chosen for something, but you don't know why or how or for what reason. And it would be interesting as a game. It would be interesting if it's a game in which people try to break the rules. It'd be interesting if it's a game that sometimes, when families play a game, for instance, in the end, everyone just sort of puts their arms up and throws the board and says, this isn't working, And that would be also interesting as a sort of speculative experiment. And I like the fact also that notion that people could opt out and construct their own experiments. And I thought that was an interesting part. And you sort of mentioned it briefly in the beginning and it kind of disappears. But I thought that was also the notion that people go off and play their own game for a while and then come back and confront confront everyone else with the results of that game and how it had gone. But I do wonder if in this vision, what I suggest is a post-political vision, without antagonism or equivalence, where collaboration is strictly banned. You say almost at the very end of the book, and I'm going to quote as Gerardo did earlier, what matters is to understand that whatever the circumstances in which the holistic society comes into being, it cannot coexist with any form of coordination of political expectations between individuals. Both its culture and the systems for defining its priorities and management are based on the expression of independent individual opinions, which are not integrated into any collective framework of interests, ideas, or other priorities. So it's this continuous game with no teams, no collaboration, no working with others. And again, I'll go back to the notion that this is as much dystopian as utopian. It feels to me a little bit like a permanent Squid Game. I don't know if you've seen that program. Recently, it came back as a reality TV program. It was originally a Korean TV drama earlier this year, I think, in which you have all these numbered individuals, and they all have to play games. They play games and play games and play games. In the original version, the price is life or death. In this version, it's not life or death, because the real torture is to be forced to continue playing. And so, yes, it feels to me like a dystopian society run by a semi-secret clandestine administration by political actors, but except they're not political actors, but the members of the various assemblies who are not known to you and with whom you are forbidden from the outset from collaborating in any way, shape, or form. And I guess I'd just put it to you, would you really wish to live in such a holistic society?
Well, this is, I mean, this would be a fair critique, but there is, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding. The fundamental misunderstanding is, what you said about collaboration. This is not how I conceive of it in the book. To me, coordination in that sense is the fundamental factor of generating power. Power which by nature excludes those who do not adhere to that specific collectivity. So there is no way, in my view, in which you can reduce the tight grip of power in a society, in a collectivity, in a community, whatever, if you do not seriously hamper the natural tendency of people to organize themselves in order to impose a view and very soon a mode of living on others. So I believe that, Balzac puts it in a nice way, that le pouvoir est une conspiration continue. It's a continuous conspiracy, power. And it's a natural conspiracy by interest. So all this, it is not about generating secrecy and putting decisions away from people, because sclerotic democracy is not known to do that. Sortition does actually the opposite. That is, takes random people, right? And it works quite well. If you look, for example, at opinion polls, right? You can have 1,000 to 2,000 people, and they represent the views of, hundreds of millions, if you do it right, right? And we know that because the outcome is compatible with the prediction. So it is not that stupid to do it. Now, the thing is that if you look at it from another point of view, this would normally work in a parliamentary democracy if the representatives of the people did not organize in parties, right? And if the representatives of the people, for example, did not organize in politbureaus at some point. So in order to break that link, because that's where power lies. Power does not lie in the ideas. Power lies in the possibility to coordinate that specific community in order to dominate others. So that's one thing. And I think it stands, as a postulate very, very much. It's not just some abstract historical anthropological view. It is rather a very pragmatic view of what we see in every radical community. For example, let's take radical, small, leftist groups. We all have, I suppose, experience of that. Every 6 months, there is a split. Because there are people who organize to do something and impose something on you, a concept, it doesn't matter, whatever, and you can't live together. That's one thing. The second thing is antagonism is there. What I'm talking about in terms of avoiding is conflict, which is another thing. That is, the difference that I'm interested in is, as I said, is that conflict converts you. That is, you're talking to somebody, let's say, wherever, and you have different political views, right? you can go on with that discussion and perhaps influence them and be influenced and so on. Once the first blow is thrown, right, then the discussion ends. Then we're somewhere else, and the important thing is who will dominate over the other. That's the point I'm making, right? So conflict, not antagonism. Thirdly, capitalism. In a view of a society that's politically evolving consciously, and this is the postulate here, capitalism, like anything else, is not a necessity. Why? Because the market is not something that is inert that we depend on. You might have seen that in one of my examples, for example, the social assembly can prioritize and demand, so to speak, from the institutions that are involved, you know, to execute the the will of the people, can demand, for example, a Gini coefficient in terms of socioeconomic equality. That goes strictly against capitalism, right? Without attacking the idea of the market as such, because that's irrelevant. That is, let's put it conversely. Sometimes, because we are on the side of criticizing capitalism, I think we tend to forget very much that capitalism is not a plan. Capitalism is a spontaneous association of interests, you know, brought forward by modernity. So if you change the conditions and the priorities in the society, the market changes, and perhaps, I would argue, very soon after that, the notion of capitalism as we know it dies. Because simply profit, you know, a margin of profit that sustains the idea of capitalism can disappear. But that's for people to decide. So I don't see why one would need to trust, so to speak, identifiable people rather than unknown peers drawn by lot. Identifiable people as politicians and decision makers have the advantage of getting symbolic benefits. And we are all prisoners of that. So it seems to me that, you know, so to speak, your vision is very much attached to maintaining a frontal adversity rather than the real revolutionary potential. That's how I see it from my point of view. You see what I mean? To me, the real revolution is disintegrating, helping power to disintegrate.
I don't want to dominate. I'm just going to be really quick, and you don't need to take this as a question, just as a comment on what you just said. It seems to me that there are two anthropological postulates here. One is that we are by nature competitive animals. The other is we're by nature organizational, conspiratorial animals too. When you take the first postulate, you make it the basis of holistic politics. But the second postulate, you say we need to do what we can to hamper that. You suggested that will reduce conflict. I suggest that, on the contrary, it's practically Hobbesian. It's a war of all against all. If we're going to choose between those two anthropological postulates, let's grant that those are two tendencies. I'd rather build a society based on our organizational, self-organizational capacities rather than our competitive capacities. But that's just my thought. Thanks again so much for this book.
No, just to make a point on this, you know, I don't believe that you know, things are as you referred to them in terms of competition, but any manual on you know, the sociality, you know, of human beings in terms of in evolutionary terms, so to speak, will tell us that these tendencies are entangled. That is, of course, collaboration and competition are entangled. The problem is that whatever you do is that you need to create groups in order to get there. And groups tend to antagonize violently. Anyway, so.
Well, just just to add something brief in relation to this last comment reference that John made, in a certain way, one could also say that the Hobbes' solution to the European civil wars, a harsh conflict, was precisely the invention of a principle of authority. Authority, what is the famous expression, right? Authority, not reason, or not truth, is the essence of the law, right? And so I want to ask you, or just more or less ask you if, so precisely, no conflict at the level of, as a way that you understand it, which will be at the level of the directive or any faction that takes power and increases domination and orients precisely the composition of society in a way that it coincides with their own will, right? In a way, one could say that the crisis of authority today amplifies. Once it becomes a vacuum, it becomes amplified into a certain hegemony of values or domination that necessarily doesn't really abide itself by a notion of authority. So as you reduce conflictivity, for me, it's easier to call it, let's say, factionalism in their drive to hegemony. Would you say that there is still, at the end of the day, in this grouping or gaming that requires holistic politics, would there still be necessary the question of, let's say, who decides, or an authority, even if it is preliminarily, right? I mean, you criticize the notion of authority a lot throughout the book, but it seems to me that this is also an instance where, even if it is, let's call it a minor authority, is sort of required, you know? And for me, this would make sense because, for instance, since I follow, and we have talked about this before, since I follow dilemmas or debates around constitutionalism and legal issues, days, precisely, I think that the left, or one of the impasses of the left, or progressivism, all things considered, is the fact that they have become a sort of value-driven, open interpretation, which leads to a sort of an anti-institutionalist position that goes from one side to the other, so a sort of endless polarization or conflictivity that goes nowhere. So basically, the question of authority in your design. And I don't know if Idris wants to add anything else. We might be having maybe like 7 or 8 minutes until we reach the end. Oh,
you're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah. I could say a little bit more if you want me, if I can jump in. Is that cool?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right, cool. So I just wanted to go, I'll take it back to the included again, right? And how and your response to that. So actually, I think we actually theorize this in a lot of similar ways, all right? You started by saying the petit bourgeois, right? And it's a term that's kind of hazy at times, right? But the two figures, the two ways that I've looked at it is from Agamben's kind of notion of the planetary petit bourgeois, and then from Guy Debord, and he speaks of the spectacular salariat, right? As like maybe like one maybe is this French model, or one is maybe this American model that's spanning the globe, right? Now, also, I do really see when I in the paper on destituent power that I think you might be referencing, I do see they included their mode of struggle, if you want to call it, their mode of activity as this kind of escape, this kind of non-activity, right? I call it destituent power as desertion in my work, right? So yeah, I think that it all tracks, right? And I tend to look at it, what they do in this kind of escape or desertion, as a kind of pure means, and that's what's important to them. And that's what's important to them, this kind of pure means that that continually plays out without saying to put forward a certain objective, but how they're doing it, or the act of, not even maybe the act, but the continuous process of doing, right? Now, the things that, and I don't have answers to this, what I want to think through and continue to think through is that, okay, even if this is an expanding group of society, this disaffected included, right? And I'm sure it's probably huge, right? But it definitely doesn't constitute the entirety of the society, right? Or the entirety of what is. So, what are the grounds to saying that what they're doing should be the way that we organize on a larger level, right, and apply to other groups, right? So that's one thing that's that question that I want to raise. The other thing is, is just, can they even complete this program, or how do they go about completing this program? One of the things with say Occupying the States or the Gilets Jaunes is that eventually people go home, right? And how do we keep them? How does that extend? How do we make it longer? How does it go out in state and time, right? So we were talking about power, and I don't think that that I'm not one of those people who think that we should undermine power. In fact, I think of destituent power as kind of the reverse of that. At least I want to theorize it as a way in which we can get rid of this kind of either anarcho-syndicalist or kind of postmodern dispersal of power, but harness, bring back almost this modernist idea of power that can somehow overcome destitutes state power. Okay. And in that way, I do see it in terms of victory or defeat, victory or loss or conflict, right? How well do these social actors manage to undermine the state, right? It might not be, seizing power in the Leninist way. It's not going to be that. But if it deserts, it deserts in order to undermine the state. And how do we make that go further? Also, and that's why I brought in the excluded, because I think that, and this just seems to be, there are other aspects there are other social actors, I'm thinking like this in two ways. During Occupy, a lot, and I'd like to hear if this occurred in Gilets Jaunes, but there were the kind of middle class people who were very active in the assemblies, but then there were also this drum circle, right, that were very homeless, right, kind of crazy, right, and they annoyed everyone, including the people downtown, the people participating in and the police, right? And I was figuring, well, this is a problem that they need to figure out. How do they incorporate them in a way that lets them work it out? Or in the French case, it would be something like, I think of the Gilets Jaunes going on in 2019. And then I think in January and February and March of this year, of 2023, the way that the movement of the general strike worked, it was definitely pulling a lot from the Yellow Vest, right? I think the reason why it was so strong, though, that strike movement was because it had gained so much experience in the streets, right? But what happens in the summer is the explosion over the killing of the Arab and African teens, right? And we see a different form of social protest. And how I want to know, at least my work is, how do those two get together? How do they link up so that whatever they're trying to do can be brought further. And I'll stop.
Right, very briefly, because I know we don't have time, as Gerardo said, on the issue, of course, of authority and the consequences of its eventual disintegration or the desirability of it, so to speak. I would agree with you, Gerardo, but here there is no loss of democratic authority, because once there is an acceptance of certition, right, within the social assembly, then again, it's trust towards peers that do not have a different position to you. So that the issue is, again, they cannot create a faction. They cannot become someone else. They are people like you, but they have all the handles, all the tools, legal and otherwise, in their hands. So they can impose a specific vision of society. And so I would say it's tough for those who disagree but are in a minority. But if they disagree too much, because they are in a minority, we don't simply choke them. That's the issue with sociodiversity, where people can branch out and say, I'll do something else, and I'll prove to you that this is a better way of doing it. Right? So there are desertions, so to speak, but they are creative desertions, in the sense that people are allowed to do what they want rather than simply leave a game and withdraw. Now, to what you said, Idris, it is true. It is definitely true, and it is devastating. People finally go home, right? And it gets worse than that. Because if they are too translated, that's what my tetralema is about, essentially, is that's how you get increasingly fascist views. I think, to me, fascism is completely misunderstood in terms of its genesis. We have so many works of it, and still, we tend to think of it as a kind of conscious notion of going towards that, rather than an issue of political frustration. So this is what happens. And if you look, for example, at the results, the electoral results in France, you'll see what the crisis of the Yellow Vests brought to us. It is terrible. It is devastating. So what I would say is that in order, if you withdraw, either you go back to your initial position with some short historical gain, which will take you about, probably, it will get your grandchildren some benefit, which is not much, right? Or worse, you will support a claim for authority, a strong claim for authority, which is dangerous for everyone. So in both ways, I don't see a specific benefit. And what you said, again, regarding the excluded, for example, people who drank too much, that was the case with the Gilets jaunes. Again, some very few homeless people and so on, but we didn't have middle class people in the Gilets jaunes, right? It was not an intellectual movement. That's why they were thought to be essentially petit bourgeois, etc. So in that sense, I would think that these people are, let's say, the middle of the rugby ball, and they are very important in order to generate a consensus around the political system. So if these people can participate and have the sense that they participate equally, and that's what, again, I'm very sorry to repeat that, that's what certition does. It gives you the guarantee of equal participation. You can't say that other people have more influence than you. That's the benefit of the clerotic democracy. Once you are in that thing, you have to live with the fact that you are in the position that you are. And this, allows for political creativity, I think. You know, I can develop, obviously, my arguments on this, but I can't tire you too much, you know. But I think there is an enormous benefit to draw from something that you know, may appear at the surface as a mere you know, equilibrium design, but in fact has to do with countering dominant power. That's the real quest of what I call holistic politics. Am I within time?
Yes, I don't want to abuse of anyone's time. I think we are about reaching the limit at this point for more or less the time that we have allotted for the conversations. But there's definitely a lot more to discuss, you know, around the book, and hopefully we can continue talking about it in other places and venues and contexts, because it's definitely a fascinating proposal, I think. So
I'd be delighted to discuss you know, anything about the book with anyone anytime, because I know it is not expected. It is not an expected version of a political theory. So there is a lot to be talked about. There you know, and a lot to be thought about, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I thank you very much for really looking at it.
yeah, for sure. Well, just one last superficial or anecdotal question. Direct democracy. So from what you said, that you have been writing it or thinking about it for 10 years. So it didn't emerge out of your study of the Yellow Vest movement cycle. It was already previous to this event?
Yes, essentially what you know, the way I wrote it is that there was a first version that you know, went out in Greek between 2000 2010. So it went out in 2011. So I started 2000, and one of the things that made me rework it again and produce another version, which is in English and French now, is that the questions that I had and the idea that I had of what could and would happen in some way did not betray the precepts of the book. Now that may be a personal bias, you know, as we all have when we write something. But I tend to think that the Yellow Vests strengthened enormously my view on how we can go forward, and how all that political energy that in the beginning is so radical, so useful, so creative, you know, and seeks to really liberate itself and change the world, you know, becomes some kind of lost cause, you know, of people devastated by what they have lived, and but their impotence, but their political impotence. You know, this is when you discuss with these people, it is terrible, you know, to see how they feel about what they have lived, and the fact that they did not manage to challenge the system, so to speak, in their way. And these people, we shall repeat it, and we must repeat it forever, they were petit bourgeois, socially speaking. Right. So there is a point to make there. Well, let's go. Sorry.
Excellent. Well, I think this is a good place to leave it here for now. And thank you to the three of you, to Michalis, to Idris, to John.
Thank you
And
so much. I'm so honored by the fact that he has a look at the book and agreed to discuss it.
Thank you very much.
thank you. We'll continue
Thank-
next year with a conversation on Giorgio Cesarano's new translation, his survival manual.
In English?
Has now appeared in Spanish.
Oh, okay. Okay. I got you. All right. Hey guys, thank you very much. Yeah. And happy holidays, everyone.
Yeah.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Bye.
And
All right. Take
Happy
care.
holidays.